Good afternoon. I'm very happy to speak about a topic that I feel like I've been talking about for about 10 years or longer. And unfortunately, I have to conclude that I still have to explain the very same things 10 years later. But, you know, needless to say, so I wanted to start with a very essential, simple idea of the healthcare system, which is that access, quality, and cost are essential components of any healthcare system, basically, because these categories basically collectively, they collectively are called the three-legged stool of healthcare, because any change in one area will inevitably affect the others. So the challenge that systems face is striking that elusive balance where all three are strong enough to support optimal health. And in reality, the system is perpetually imbalanced, and policymakers are constantly overcorrecting in the area that is a hot topic of the moment, whether it may be quality or cost or any of these three. So I wanted to share some numbers. Some are, you know, I would call them a little bit cliche, but maybe for some of them, for some of you, they're new. So healthcare spending is under great scrutiny from the cost perspective, as it accounted for almost 11.5% of the GDP in 2014 in France. And on average, France spends about 5,000 euros per capita on healthcare. So cost projections suggest that national health spending will continue to outpace economic growth. And France is actually not unique in Europe when it comes to these types of projections. In fact, some other countries see their healthcare expenditure grow exponentially even more. So the same year, in 2014, we find that the percentage of healthcare spending for prescription drugs is actually higher than in most other European countries. I don't know how you knew that. And the United States, believe it or not. Pharmaceutical spending is actually predicted to continue to rise sharply in the coming years. So French policymakers, like many of their colleagues actually across Europe, face the challenge to contain costs in the coming years. So one of the ways to do this, which has already been successfully applied in France and in many other countries, is by implementing so-called reference pricing for pharmaceutical products. And I will outline a few different pricing strategies in my presentation, and I will address how these influence the value and, more generally, health outcomes in the longer run. So, borrowed from other markets, the concept of reference pricing really is a strategy in which a product is sold at a price just below its main competing brand. So in healthcare specifically, this strategy has been used to reimburse products or services at a rate just below the price for similar products or services. And it's been applied to pharmaceutical, and maybe some of you don't know this, also increasingly to standardized procedures such as surgeries, knee surgeries, for example. So reference pricing typically is a tool to increase downward price pressure on services where there is meaningful variation in price without supposedly a meaningful variation in quality. So it might be a good idea for pharmaceuticals or certain surgeries and standardized procedures, but maybe not so much for chronic care, end of life, or other healthcare services. So the rhetoric for reference pricing is that patients have the choice between low-cost quality care and more expensive alternatives. That's the rhetoric. And patient pays the difference between the reimbursement by the insurance company and the actual price of the product. In other words, the goal of reference pricing is basically shifting the cost of the price difference from a third-party payer, like the insurance company, to the health consumer. So to evaluate how successful this policy measure really is, in essence, people should actually research to what extent patients really have a choice instead of simply measuring whether implementation of reference pricing has lowered overall costs. Because, of course, if you lower prices, overall cost will be lower. So since some research and assessments have monitored disparities in choices and others have simply measured the savings and expenses, the results of these reference pricing systems at place in Europe seem to be inconclusive. But the question I'd like to address today is, are these reference pricing mechanisms also successful in safeguarding minimal quality of pharmaceutical care? Or is it simply replacing a better but more expensive drug with a cheap one but less effective, usually generic alternative? So differences in treatment options have to be fully assessed, and a lot of studies have actually suggested that there are substantial differences in health outcomes. It's also been suggested by researchers that patients reduce their use of essential medications in reference pricing systems, and that reference pricing actually increases the rate of emergency department visits and serious adverse events associated with reductions in drug use. In other words, you may decrease overall cost. The question is, are you really decreasing this? What are you exactly measuring? Are you measuring pharmaceutical decreases in cost, or are you also taking into account where this patient ends up? Does he end up in the emergency department, or will he need other treatments in the near future? Most of these studies actually don't take these aspects into account. So what we do know with certainty is that the implementation of reference pricing schemes for pharmaceutical products in healthcare systems in France and Germany and the Netherlands and Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Czech Republic, Poland, and many others have actually resulted in overall healthcare savings. That is, like I said, the overall healthcare costs of those countries may have gone up due to other factors, but the prices of pharmaceuticals have gone down, and so the macro cost for pharmaceutical consumption accordingly. So as you can see in this map here, most EU countries use some form of reference pricing, but the concept refers to many different price control schemes. And I'm going to focus on the difference between external reference pricing and what we call internal reference pricing, or therapeutic reference pricing, and different adverse effects of these pricing schemes. In general, where internal reference pricing focuses on pricing with a defined market, in this case France, external reference pricing focuses on pricing across defined markets, in this case other EU countries or even beyond Europe. So internal reference pricing is also sometimes called simple or class-based or therapeutic reference pricing. Simple basically refers to the fact that insurers reimburse brand name pharmaceuticals at the same amount as generics, and that patients basically pay the difference. And it's employed in many countries to some extent to contain the cost of pharmaceuticals and shift consumption from branded drugs to generic alternatives. So class-based internal reference pricing refers to a system where all products in a class are reimbursed at a level determined by factors of manufacturer's supply prices, such as life cycle assessments and mean rates. And these programs usually require a drug to enter, a drug manufacturer to enter into and have in effect a national rebate agreement with the government or other official entity in exchange for nationally defined coverage of most of the manufacturer's drugs. So the amount of a rebate due for each unit of a drug is based on all sorts of complicated statutory formulas related to the average manufacturer price. In fact, it's so complicated, I think that I understand basic language, but it took me a few years to understand the Dutch pharmaceutical drug policies. So the therapeutic value is established by some governmental body. They develop complicated algorithms which evaluate the degree of innovation and create a class and a numerical score based on innovativeness, precise evaluation of the treated population, the so-called endpoints, which are primary and secondary endpoints, and the type of treatment and the comparison of the duration of the therapeutic effect. It's kind of a discussion about, you have a Samsung S5, my husband has a Samsung S7, you know, who assesses what the real difference is? Because that's really what it comes down to. So these algorithms also take into account health technology assessment. They do have some sort of objective measurements. And they relate to innovation, to the costs that are important in the final evaluation for sustainability of potential innovation. On that matter, I must say, you know, like Maurice just said, I live in the United States, and it's not really joking, but I do comment a lot that, you know, Europe in general is free riding on the US when it comes to real innovation. Because we're all complaining that in the US, prices are so incredibly high, but if it weren't for the US, we wouldn't have real innovation in Europe. So, yeah, I wanted to briefly touch upon what we call therapeutically equivalent, because I'm not a medical doctor. I have a bit of a clinical background, but I find it very puzzling what we call equivalent, because like I said, in the case of cell phones, we think that incremental innovation is real innovation. We think that moving from an S5 to an S7 is a real step forward, but for some reason in pharmaceuticals, we're not willing to take the same sort of reasoning. So if something is incremental, we think that, you know, it's kind of equivalent. So what is the definition of equivalent? So sometimes we look at the active substance. So for example, medicines with the same active substance, the existing level 5. Or we look at what we call the pharmacological class, so medicines with chemically related active substances. Therapeutic class, so medicines that have a comparable therapeutic effect. We also sometimes refer to generic reference pricing, and that basically refers to what we call a level 1 reference group, whereas a therapeutic reference pricing relates to level 2 and level 3 reference groups. So I just wanted to point out that I've studied quite a few reference pricing systems in the EU, and if you look at different classes, it's very unclear which one the system uses. For some classes, we use generic reference pricing. For some, we use pharmacological classes, so some external pharmacological institutes, for example, assess the therapeutic difference, but it's really unclear what exactly the main focus of equivalent products means. So, the methods for establishing reference groups in European countries are outlined in this table here. So as you can see, France is actually one of the countries focusing on the active substance. Although, if you look in detail, there are some classes where France actually also focuses on other ways of establishing classes, equivalent classes. So the next table actually outlines how different EU countries define reference pricing for a therapeutic class. So France bases its prices within a cluster on the average price of a generic medication in that class. But actually for some clusters, France actually bases its price even on the lowest price generic medicines. It really depends on the class. In contrast, the Netherlands, for example, where I'm from, bases its prices on the weighted average price of medicines over various years. And basically also takes price development into account. So then there is a second reference pricing system. We call this external or cross-nation or international reference pricing. And that basically refers to the system in which reimbursements are limited in one country by reference to prices of the same drug in one or usually more other countries. So we call this external reference pricing, and it's been used in various countries across the EU, as well as Asia and Canada. Japan, for example, sets reimbursement levels for both public and private schemes in their healthcare system at an amount that doubles the average of prices in the US, the UK, France, and Germany. So the initial reimbursement rates are adjusted down every 2 years, and they're based on the foreign and domestic price surveys and overall spending reduction. Canada, just to give you an idea of what the world does, has a system of external reference pricing, and they set their prices based on a median price charged in France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. So external reference pricing simply makes it easier to compare cost containment in countries as related to health outcomes and quality of treatments. It also helps reducing the remarkable variability in drug prices across the EU and beyond. The actual approach to calculating reference price really differs among countries, and the details of the algorithms that are used for external reference pricing also remain very unclear, like with internal reference pricing. So here in France, for example, the derivation of the external reference price is based on the stipulation that the initial listing price should not be lower than the lowest price observed in the comparator countries, which for France are actually Germany, Italy, Spain, and UK. In the Netherlands, again, the reference price is determined by means of calculating the average price from its comparative countries, which are actually Belgium, France, Germany, and UK. However, the precise definition of average is not really expressed outright, and this would clearly be relevant, I think, given the limited number of countries. So means would easily be influenced by a single outlier, whereas a median would be difficult to identify. So just again, to give you an idea of how this inter-country system works, generally the number and composition of countries considered for comparison varies, but a recent study of 27 EU member states plus Norway reported that the number of countries in a given basket to range from under 5 to over 20 countries. So the researchers actually noted that among those EU member states that use external reference pricing, which is the majority of EU member states actually, the United Kingdom was actually among the most frequently referenced, following Germany, Spain, and France. So France actually is a core country for other countries to